Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan Your Part Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it.
Today feels like part 4 of Paul's question and answer session with the Corinthians. Today we're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I feel like we have visited this topic before. I mean, for the most part, the chapter feels like it's about food sacrificed to idols. There's a little bit more here, which we're going to dig into today.
Yeah, it doesn't stop here. The Q&A session does not stop after this chapter. It just continues to go.
I like Q&A, Paul.
Sometimes,
He's very random. He's like, here's an answer to your question. Also, I'm definitely allowed to be an apostle. Now let's get back to your question. I'm a really valuable apostle.
Yeah, that. I think what is interesting about today's chapter is that the Corinthian church is being compared a whole lot to the Israelites of the Old Testament and their journey through the wilderness and the decisions that they made. And if you're ever getting compared to Israel, which I think we all could, but if that is the example that's used like first and foremost, that's not ever really a good sign.
It could be a good, it could be either or. It could be good, it could be bad. If they're comparing
them to Joshua and Caleb, yes. The rest of them, not so much.
Yeah. There is actually, I mean, obviously it's unfortunate that he is comparing them to the Israelites who mostly died in the wilderness, basically, right?
Because of disobedience.
Of disobedience.
And a lot of it dealing with idolatry.
There is a case to be made here for us today. If you look at what Paul's doing, basically, very quickly, very rapid fire, like he'll mention a story and then he'll mention that this was done and written down and recorded so that we would learn from it.
We both enjoyed this verse a lot for some reason. Because I read it to you.
He does it a couple times. He does it a couple times. If you look at verse 6, he says, "Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did." If you look at verse 11, "Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of ages has come." And then I guess that's kind of the end of what he's doing, but it's kind of like a quick pointed story that they would have understood rather quickly because it's a huge part of their history. And then like a point being made that is like, this is for our instruction. And I would say this is a pretty good chapter to use as a support for the fact that we need to know and understand the Bible. You're probably like, that's probably not a surprise to you if you're a regular listener. But Paul's actually doing the same thing that we try to do on a regular basis. Like, hey, understand the Bible, because what is told in the Bible, what is recorded in the Bible, it is valuable for our own instruction. And what Paul's teaching them here is don't be disobedient to God, don't fall to temptation, and make sure that you run the race with endurance so that you receive the reward at the end of the race. Remember, the chapters are kind of put in here by Bible editors. So actually, like the first part of chapter 10 is probably like a natural continuation of the last part of chapter 9, where he's talking about being careful that you're not disqualified. And then he flows quickly into this story about the Israelites and how they were, in large part and in mass, disqualified because of their disobedience.
Mm-hmm. And that even includes Moses, which is kind of crazy too, because
poor Moses.
I know, his silly decision to smack the rock instead of have like mercy on the people kept him from going into the promised land. Serious bummer. But again, kind of like what I was alluding to the other day, what you sort of just said, Paul wants to make sure that he also does not fall into the temptation of sin, because that eliminated Moses' ability to enjoy that part of God's promise.
On that note, and I'll put this in the category of extra credit Bible nerdery, if you look at what he says about the rock is like a clear character in the story, basically, because the rock shows up at the beginning of the Israelites' journey, because the water comes out of it, and the rock shows up at the end of the Israelites' journey. Again, they're supposed to have the water come out of it, and Moses strikes it instead of speaking to it. But what Paul says about the rock is definitely worth some attention. And if you look at verse 4, "And all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." There's a note here in our study Bible that rock was like commonly understood as a term for God. And here Paul is saying like, hey, the rock is Christ. He's just connecting. Like, he doesn't mean the rock is literally Christ.
He does make connections, though, because he alludes to then when he talks about in, I think it's verses 14, 15, 16, he talks about the cup and the bread.
Right. But there is a like a little bit of a history and a little bit of a tradition that has developed over long periods of time that the rock is meant to represent Christ. And Paul here is teaching that the rock represents Christ, and we don't want to be disqualified in our endurance, in our race to honor Christ.
So we have all this.
Yes.
There's this comparison with the Israelites. And then after that verse that we talked about, verse 11, these things are an example for us because they're written down for our instruction. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. And it goes into the next verse, which I always was like, this is kind of sad. This verse, I think, gets very twisted, verse 12.
Well, it's always pulled out of context.
What, like, some cute little saying is versus what's in the Bible. It does say, therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. So I think that is an important verse as well, because he's talking about this idea to kind of like stray away and be, I guess, worshiping idols, but also, I guess, a problem for the Corinthians was not only that they're worshiping idols, but they're consciously saying, well, I'm a follower of Christ, but I'm still doing this other weird worship
they're
on the
not
side.
All in. I think that's why he's consistently reminding them of this disqualification situation.
Well, his next verse, right after that,
take it away, Jenny.
It says, my beloved, flee from idolatry. So it's obvious that this was a real problem for them. So he's trying to tell them, like, you can't be in both at one time.
So I think these are connected thoughts, because then he goes into talking about essentially eating food sacrificed to idols again. He does it by setting up this idea of the Lord's table, and he talks about this cup of blessing which we bless. He's going to use that language again. That is apparently like very common ancient Jewish language that they certainly Paul understood, and certainly some segments of the audience may have understood. But he's setting up this idea that we eat and drink to honor Christ when we gather for the Lord's table for like this communion exercise. It would have been like a full-scale meal and everything. And he talks about that. And it's not by mistake that he jumps then immediately into food sacrifice to idols, because he wants to make the case that we can't be actively engaged at the Lord's table and also actively engaged at the table of demons. He actually says that in verse 21. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? And then he talks about how to handle this food situation, which apparently was a very pressing concern for the Corinthian Christians.
And it comes back again to not necessarily, and this might, I don't know, this seemed like it was a little confusing for us. So verses 23 all the way to the end of the chapter, which would have been essentially like 33-ish. Yeah, 33. He's talking about when you go to someone's home and there's meat on the table, don't make it a point to say, was this offered to idols?
Just enjoy the invitation.
Yeah, just enjoy the time you're there. But if it would come up, where's that verse at? But if someone tells you, I think it's verse 28, this has been offered in sacrifice, then don't eat the meat, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? So it is a little goofy in that, like, you don't want to make a fuss about it, but if somebody like blatantly says, well, that was offered to idols,
yes,
then you're going to make a point to be like, well, you know what? I'm going to just pass on that then, because it's almost like we were talking the other day about like those spiritual, like festival type things, or celebrations for pagans.
Yes.
You don't want to like purposefully take part in it because it will cause someone else to stumble or sin. Although it doesn't change the fact that you're not eating like evil meat.
There is, yes. So commentators are split on this. Some commentators believe that this is like Christians speaking to Christians. Jenny actually was reading one that was that perspective. Other commentators believe this is Christians speaking to non-Christians.
Right.
You can split hairs on this. I would encourage you always read the chapter for yourself. But if you find yourself being a little bit confused, just read it carefully and slowly. Maybe read it more than once. Paul is picking up on a case that he already made in chapter 8 Chapter 8 feels like it's a little bit more Christians concerning Christians, like how weaker brothers see stronger brothers, wise, unwise, that kind of stuff. It really does seem like the topic at hand here in chapter 10 is how to handle basically like attending a dinner at somebody else's house. And I feel like this is the Ryan Zook opinion. I think he's talking about believers and non-believers. He's saying like, hey, if you get invited to dinner, just go over to dinner and eat dinner and just eat it and enjoy it, because you know that idols aren't real. They're just pieces of wood and stone, and a food sacrificed to an idol is like unaffected. You don't have to worry about it because they're not real in the first place. He does say they're also demons. So essentially what he's saying is like, you're not going to accidentally honor something that's pretend.
Right.
But then he says, hey, if they mention to you, hey, this food has been sacrificed to an idol, then you need to abstain for the benefit of that other person's conscience. Because if this is why I think it's an unbeliever. If they know you're a believer, if they know you're a Christian, and they see that you have no hesitations about partaking in essentially idol worship, what they would perceive to be idol worship, then that would be bad for them, because they would assume that, hey, like, you think this thing that I'm doing is not sinful, when in fact we know it is sinful.
But I think there's a really good case for the other way around too, though, because it says that if a weaker believer, because their conscience would be one to be very like pointed and hey, we shouldn't be doing that.
Right.
So I think there's a case to be made that this could be a conversation between believers as well, if they are at a place where food has been offered to idols. If a weaker, if you will, or newer in faith believer says we're not allowed to eat that,
then just don't eat it.
It's helpful. I would say it's more likely that would be the situation, because you don't, again, want that other brother to fall or stumble in sin. And because this was a letter to the Corinthian church, I think I kind of resonate there a little bit more, because they had all kinds of believers. They had really new, fresh ones, the like weaker, if you will. Paul words, not mine. And then ones who would be a little bit more seasoned or more discipled in their faith. So I think I might resonate with that one a little more. Just saying.
It's really interesting, because no matter what the circumstance, Paul is saying like, hey, if you are strong in your faith and you understand things, you almost always find yourself in a situation where you are yielding to someone who understands it less.
Just to be that example.
To be an example.
Right.
And a lot of times I think, and I've made this case already a couple days ago when we looked at chapter 8, a lot of times people will use these chapters to make a case that they don't have to care, when in fact these chapters teach that you should care, and you should be careful to enter into things that can be perceived as sinful, even if they're not.
It's kind of a weird thing, because it's almost like the person who has the most wisdom on it is the one that doesn't fall to either side.
That's exactly it.
But you would think that there would be a side, but you're honoring the one who is very convicted.
Yes.
But you're not dishonoring the one who's very convicted either.
Right. The whole
so
point.
Bizarre.
The whole point is to bring honor and glory to Christ. So you
Through
can
very strong discernment.
You can eat whatever you want, but if you're sitting and eating with someone that's like, oh, by the way, I did sacrifice this to an idol, then you're done. You're not going to eat it.
Yeah, right.
Because you want to be a witness to that person, and you want to take an opportunity to say, hey, my God would not permit that. It is not honoring to God for me to do that. So you're using that situation as an opportunity to honor God and promote a conversation about faith and who God is.
I often think too, I know of people and like have been around people who will specifically not eat certain meats, not because it's been offered to idols or any of the things, but because they feel that it's like unclean, unholy to eat. And so what's interesting about that, I'm not going to sit and like, I've learned, you don't sit and argue about it. You are respectful of their decision, their choice, and the actual conversation that is like soul convicting comes out in ways that have nothing to do with the food at all whatsoever. It's like the faith conversations and the things that we believe that are more reflective of our relationship with God, what we believe, all of those things, more so than the food itself.
I think it's really interesting that these conversations where Paul is saying, he actually says, this is in verse 23, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. The person in the strongest position, the people who have the strongest faith, actually are going to do fewer things because of it. because you're trying so hard to honor non-believing or less believing people. And a lot of times these are twisted to be like, hey, I have strong faith. I can do whatever I want. And that's not what Paul seems to be teaching. Paul seems to be teaching like, hey, because you're in a stronger position, then you can be comfortable doing less because you want to be honorable to other non-believing or less believing people. So interesting thing. I mean, chapter 10 is definitely some of that Q&A, but we are revisiting that food sacrifice to idols situation.
So where are you going to land us for your
Oh, man,
part?
I was going to try to set you up with that. I actually really like these verses.
Verse 11 and 6?
I was actually going to say 23. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Don't forget that we should be striving to build up the faith of other people. And I think that is building up the faith of people who have no faith and building up the faith of people who have weaker faith or less faith. And it is interesting how you start to see the world when that is your motivation.
Yeah.
So Paul's, again, I'm a broken record at this point. Paul's saying, hey, there's a lot of things you're allowed to do, but some things you're not going to do because you're trying to strengthen the faith of others.
It's not about you.
And so I would just remind you today, if you're headed into work or if you're coming home from work or you're headed home to your family, whatever it is you're doing, it's not about you. It's about building up and strengthening the faith of other people. Sometimes they're unbelievers. Sometimes they're just weaker believers, but we should be concerned about them and driving them further in their relationship with God. So I hope you got something out of this message today. We'll see you tomorrow for 1 Corinthians 11 and head coverings. We'll see you then.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed the episode today and are enjoying God's Plan Your Part, we would love it if you could help us in 2 ways. First, if you would give us a rating and review for our podcast, we would really appreciate that. And second, tell your friends, tell all your people that you rub shoulders with every day to listen to the podcast and also give us ratings and reviews as well. That being said, here is the reading for today.
1 Corinthians chapter 10. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, the most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of ages has come. Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide a way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we are many, are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any questions on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions on the grounds of conscience. But if someone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice," then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you, and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I gave thanks? So, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me, as I am of Christ. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.